town square was unusually crowded that Sunday afternoon. The sun hung low, painting the cracked bricks in shades of gold and rust, as families shuffled in from every corner of the small village. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, elders leaned on their canes, and the air buzzed with uneasy anticipation. At the center of it all stood the Virgin Mary statue, weathered but dignified, her hands folded in prayer, her expression serene, as though centuries of whispered pleas and candles lit at her feet had never been forgotten. And standing only a few feet away from her was Pastor John. He was a tall man with a powerful presence, known as much for his booming sermons as for his stubborn defiance of traditions. His voice had led countless hymns. His hands had baptized dozens of children. And yet, in recent months, something had shifted in him. Where others saw faith in stone, he saw weakness. Where others found comfort in ritual, he saw idolatry. He gripped the heavy hammer in his hands, its head gleaming dully in the late afternoon light. Gasps spread through the crowd as people realized what he intended to do. The widow Maria, who had lit candles at the statue every evening for nearly 30 years, clutched her rosary so tightly the beads pressed painfully into her palm. A group of teenagers stopped whispering and stared wide-eyed. Even children who didn't fully understand sensed something terrible was about to happen. "Brothers and sisters," Pastor John began, his voice steady but filled with a cold conviction. "For too long, this village has bowed before this piece of stone. For too long, you have placed your hope in carved rock rather than in the living God. This statue," he pointed at Mary's gentle figure, "is nothing more than plaster and paint. It cannot hear you. It cannot help you. It cannot save you." His words cut deep, stirring anger in some, fear in others. From the back of the crowd, a man muttered, "Blasphemy." Another voice, quieter but trembling, asked, "But she has always been with us, hasn't she?" The pastor raised the hammer high above his head, his arms trembling not from hesitation but from the sheer weight of the moment. "You must understand," he declared, "this has no power. Only God has power. And today I will prove it." The hammer came down with a sickening crack. The sound echoed across the square, louder than any hymn, sharper than any church bell. The Virgin Mary's face split down the middle, fragments scattering across the cobblestones. The crowd erupted. Some screamed, others fell silent in stunned disbelief. The widow Maria dropped to her knees, clutching her rosary, tears streaming down her face. A child wailed, his small hands covering his ears, and yet Pastor John's voice rose above the chaos, defiant, unyielding. "Look," he cried, "it shatters like any stone. Do you not see? You prayed to it, you believed in it, but it is nothing. Nothing." The broken statue lay at his feet, its head severed, its once serene face now gazing upward from the ground as though still unshaken by the violence. A hush fell over the square, broken only by the muffled sobs of the faithful. Even those who weren't particularly devout found themselves unsettled, as though something sacred had been torn away. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice whispered, "This isn't right." Another answered, "God forgive him." The widow Maria lifted her face toward the shattered statue, and in a voice trembling with age but strong in faith, whispered words that carried across the silence, "She has never abandoned us. Even now, she will not." Her words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, wrapping themselves around the villagers' hearts. Some clasped their hands in prayer instinctively, unable to look away from the broken figure on the ground. Others turned away, unsettled, ashamed to have witnessed it. Pastor John, however, only stood taller. "You will thank me one day," he said, his voice lower now, almost exhausted. "One day you will see this was for your own good." He dropped the hammer onto the ground with a metallic thud, the sound vibrating through the silence. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some supporting one another as though they had just walked away from a funeral. Children whispered to each other about the way the statue's eyes seemed almost alive before the hammer struck. Others avoided speaking altogether, afraid that words might break something fragile in the air. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, the broken pieces of the Virgin Mary statue remained scattered across the square. A single candle, placed at her feet earlier that morning, still flickered stubbornly, the flame refusing to go out despite the evening breeze. Pastor John walked away, his figure dark against the fading light. His steps were firm, but his shadow stretched long and uneasy across the cobblestones. Behind him, the townspeople lingered near the ruins, unable to leave, unwilling to abandon what had been lost. The silence was heavy, suffocating, yet within it pulsed something unspoken, something waiting. Because what Pastor John didn't realize, what no one yet knew, was that the story of the broken statue had only just begun. What came after would leave even him speechless. The morning after the statue was shattered, the village square felt like a graveyard. The pieces of the Virgin Mary still lay scattered across the cobblestones, though someone had gathered the largest fragments into a small pile, as though hoping they might somehow be put back together. Her head, cracked but intact, rested atop the rubble. Her eyes cast upward, still serene, despite the violence done to her. A hush hung over the town. People passed through the square on their way to the bakery, the market, or the well, but each one slowed, glancing toward the broken statue. Some crossed themselves in silence. Others shook their heads and muttered under their breath. By midday, the villagers began to talk, and with talk came division. "He was right," muttered Thomas, the miller, his hands thick with flour dust. He stood outside the bakery, speaking to anyone who would listen. "Faith isn't in stone, it's in God alone." Pastor John showed us what we should have realized long ago. A few nodded, uneasy but agreeing. "Maybe it's true," one said. "Maybe we've been too focused on her, forgetting the one above." But not everyone saw it that way. Near the fountain, where old women gathered with their baskets, tears flowed freely. "How could he?" whispered one. "That statue was with us when my son went to war. I prayed there every day until he returned." Another added, "My husband lit a candle there before he died. He said he felt her presence." And now her voice broke. The widow Maria, who had knelt in the square the day before, was still there now. Her frail hands moved gently over the fragments, as though caressing the wounds of a loved one. She picked up a small piece of stone, the fold of Mary's robe, and pressed it to her chest. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "She has never abandoned us." Even now, children gathered around her, curious and solemn, sensing the weight of her grief. One small boy reached for her hand and asked softly, "Is she gone?" Maria smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "No, child. She is never gone. Even in pieces, she is here." Word spread of her quiet vigil. Some found hope in it. Others scoffed. "It's superstition," grumbled Peter, the butcher. "The pastor was right. Stones can't save us, But even as he said it, he avoided looking toward the square as though afraid of what he might see. By evening, the village was split. Arguments erupted in doorways, in the market, even inside the church. Families quarreled. Neighbors turned cold. On one side stood those who believed Pastor John had done the right thing, tearing down idolatry to remind the people of true faith. On the other side were those who felt he had desecrated something sacred, tearing at the very heart of their community. The tension grew heavier each passing day. At the tavern, men argued late into the night. "He showed courage," one insisted. "He did what none of us dared." Another slammed his fist onto the table. "Courage? It was arrogance. You don't spit on generations of faith and call it courage." The village priest, Father Gabriel, tried to calm the storm. Standing at the pulpit that Sunday, he said, "Faith is not divided. Faith is not in stone alone, nor is it in words alone. Faith is in the heart." But his words did little to heal the wound. People left church still whispering, still divided, still carrying anger in their eyes. And yet in the square, the widow Maria remained. Every evening, she knelt among the broken pieces, her rosary glinting faintly in the candlelight she lit by the rubble. At first, she prayed alone. Then a neighbor joined her, then another. Soon, small groups gathered each night, whispering prayers into the dusk. Across the street, others shook their heads. "This is exactly what Pastor John warned us about," muttered Thomas the miller. "Worshipping stones." But his voice wavered as he spoke, for even he could not explain why his heart felt heavy each time he passed the square. It wasn't just the statue that had been broken, it was the town itself. Children began asking questions their parents couldn't answer. Why did he smash her? Was she angry with us? Will she come back? Their innocent voices pierced through the quarrels of adults, leaving silence in their wake. In the midst of it all, Pastor John carried himself with an air of certainty, but inside, whispers of doubt began to gnaw at him. Though he told himself he had done the right thing, he could not erase the image of Maria kneeling at the rubble, her face streaked with tears, yet radiant with faith. The divide deepened. Some saw the destruction as an ending. Others, quietly, began to wonder if it was the beginning of something far greater. Because when the statue fell, it wasn't just stone that shattered. Something invisible had cracked wide open in the heart of the village, something that would not stay buried for long. The third day after the statue's destruction, something unusual began to stir in the square. At first, it was subtle. The air around the broken pieces of the Virgin Mary seemed strangely different, lighter, almost fragrant. Maria, the widow who refused to leave the rubble, was the first to notice it. She bent forward, touching her face to the cold stone, and when she inhaled, a faint scent of roses filled her lungs. She lifted her head, blinking in surprise, certain her senses had betrayed her. But when she whispered to the neighbor kneeling beside her, "Do you smell it too?" the woman's eyes widened, and she nodded. The fragrance lingered, soft but undeniable, carrying across the square. Soon, even those who came only to mock or scoff hesitated, sniffing the air with furrowed brows. "It's nothing," said Thomas the miller. "Someone nearby must have spilled perfume." But there was no perfume, no flowers in bloom, no source at all for the sweetness that wrapped around the broken statue like an invisible veil. By evening, the whispers had begun. "It is a sign," Maria said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "Even in pieces, she gives us roses." That same night, another mystery unfolded. A villager, passing through the square at dusk, noticed the small candle Maria had placed by the rubble still flickering, though the wax should have long melted away. Curious, he leaned closer. The flame burned steady, but the candle itself seemed untouched, as though frozen in time. Hours passed. The night grew cold, and still the candle burned. The same length, the same flame, never diminishing. By morning, news of the unmelting candle had spread across the village. Crowds gathered in the square to see for themselves. Some dropped to their knees, crossing themselves in reverence. Others muttered accusations of trickery. "Someone replaces it each night," scoffed Peter the butcher. But when he tried to prove his point by standing watch, he left before dawn, exhausted and bewildered. The candle had burned straight through the night, untouched, unchanging. Children, drawn by the murmurs of mystery, became the most curious witnesses of all. They began to linger near the rubble during the day, peering at the broken fragments with wide eyes. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, a group of them ran breathlessly through the streets, shouting, "Light! We saw light!" Their parents scolded them for stirring nonsense, but the children swore by what they had seen. They claimed the fragments of the statue, especially the cracked head of Mary, had glowed faintly in the twilight, as though a hidden fire pulsed inside the stone. It was like stars, one little girl insisted, clutching her doll tight. It flickered just like the sky. At first, the villagers dismissed it as childish fancy, but as the nights passed, more and more people began reporting the same thing. Faint glimmers, like candlelight reflected in water, shimmering across the surface of the broken stone. Sometimes just a flash, sometimes a soft, steady glow. The pastor, of course, dismissed it all as coincidence. From the pulpit, his voice rang stern and unyielding. "Do not be deceived by tricks of the mind. Fragrance fades, light deceives the eye, and candles can be tampered with. These are distractions, nothing more." But his words did not erase the unease in his own heart. Late at night, when he closed his eyes, the faint scent of roses still seemed to linger in his nostrils, and when he walked past the square, he could not bring himself to look directly at the rubble. The villagers, however, could not look away. Every evening the square filled with people, some in prayer, some in quiet awe, others in heated debate. Families who had argued days earlier now gathered together again, united by questions too large to ignore. Was it real? Was it imagined? Or was it something beyond all explanation? The tension grew sharper. Skeptics scoffed openly, saying the widow Maria was orchestrating some elaborate trick to shame the pastor. Believers, on the other hand, grew more steadfast, insisting that no trick of man could keep a candle burning untouched or perfume the air with roses where none grew. And in the midst of it all, Maria remained by the rubble, her rosary beads worn thin between her fingers. "You cannot silence what was holy," she whispered each night, her voice carrying into the quiet. "Even in pieces, she speaks." One evening, as the crowd murmured and argued, a storm rolled across the horizon. Thunder cracked, wind whipped through the square, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. The villagers scattered, ducking under awnings and racing toward their homes. But Maria did not move. Kneeling in the rain, her body soaked, she lit another candle by the rubble. To the astonishment of those who watched from their windows, the flame did not go out. Rain poured, the wind howled, yet the tiny light burned steady, unshaken. The fragrance of roses returned, carried strangely by the storm, winding through the drenched streets like incense. By morning, The arguments had shifted. Fewer voices spoke of coincidence. More whispered of mercy. For the first time since the statue was destroyed, the town began to lean towards something it could not quite name. Not proof, not certainty, but wonder. And wonder, once awakened, is hard to silence. The pastor had always been a man of certainty. His sermons were sharp, his words unwavering, his convictions as solid as the stone he had shattered. And yet, in the weeks after the Virgin Mary statue lay broken in the square, certainty began to slip from his grasp like water through clenched fists. It began with the dreams. The first one came quietly, almost gentle, though it left him shaken. In it, he found himself standing in the very square where he had delivered his act of defiance. The rubble lay scattered at his feet, moonlight gleaming faintly across the broken face of Mary. But then, slowly, the stones began to stir. Out of the fragments rose a woman, clothed in light, her features sorrowful yet tender. She did not speak, but her silence was louder than thunder. Her hands extended, not in accusation, not in wrath, but in mercy. The pastor woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. He turned his head toward the window, the moonlight spilling across his bed, and for a moment he swore he still saw her, standing just beyond the glass, watching, waiting. He shook himself free, muttering prayers under his breath, forcing his breathing to steady. A dream, he told himself, only a dream. But the dreams returned. Night after night, he found her there, a figure of light, her gaze filled with sorrow that pierced deeper than anger ever could. She never raised her voice, never condemned him. She only asked without words, why? Why wound what only wants to heal? Each morning he awoke more unsettled, more exhausted. His prayers grew frantic, his sermons sharper. From the pulpit, his voice carried an edge it had never borne before. "Do not be deceived," he thundered. "Idolatry is a trap of the weak. Stone cannot save you, nor can wood. Do not bow to fragments. Bow only to God." The congregation nodded, but uneasily. Many of them had smelled the roses. Many had seen the candle that never burned away. Many had heard their children whisper of lights in the rubble. They shifted uncomfortably in their pews as the pastor's words grew harsher, the lines on his face deeper, his voice rising almost in desperation. Some even whispered that his fury was not conviction, but fear. For while the pastor preached harder against idolatry, the village itself moved in a different rhythm. Quietly, almost secretly at first, people began to gather at the broken statue again. They came at dusk, carrying small candles, placing flowers in the cracks of the stone. They knelt in silence, whispering prayers not to the stone itself, but to what it represented, to the mercy they felt still lingered there. Maria, the widow, led them. Her frail hands shook as she lit her candles, but her voice was steady as she prayed aloud, drawing others close. She has never abandoned us. Even now, she listens. Children sat cross-legged in the dirt, their eyes fixed on the fragments. Men who had once mocked their wives for clinging to old superstitions now stood quietly behind them, their arms folded, unsure but unwilling to leave. Even those who still doubted felt compelled to linger, if only for the strange peace that settled over the square when the prayers began. And the pastor knew. He saw them from his window at night, the flicker of candles glowing against the darkness, the low murmur of voices carried on the wind. He told himself it was foolishness, weakness, rebellion against his authority, but something deeper gnawed at him. The fear that what he had destroyed still lived, still breathed, still spoke louder in silence than he could with all his sermons. The dreams gave him no rest. One night, they grew darker. He stood again in the square, but this time the rubble bled. From the cracks of the broken statue seeped streams of water, clear and bright, spilling into the dust. The villagers rushed forward, cupping their hands, drinking, weeping. And as they did, the sorrowful woman lifted her gaze to him. Her lips did not move, but her eyes asked the question he could not bear. "Why did you try to silence me?" He awoke choking, clutching his throat, his sheets damp with sweat. The following Sunday, his voice cracked in the pulpit. He pounded the lectern, trying to drown out the trembling in his chest. "You are deceived by signs and wonders," he shouted. "Do not bow to shadows. God does not dwell in stone." But as his voice echoed off the church walls, he caught sight of Maria in the back pew, her eyes closed, her rosary in hand. She did not argue, did not raise her voice, but her peace was louder than his rage. That night, as he walked home alone, he heard faint singing drifting from the square. Women's voices, soft and unwavering, weaving hymns into the night. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight. But instead of anger, he felt a strange ache rising in him, the ache of a man who feared he was fighting a battle he could not win. A sense of something larger was building. The villagers whispered it first, then said it aloud. "Even in pieces, she is still here." Children left small drawings of Mary on the stones. Men laid down their tools to light candles before going home. Women who had once wept now smiled as they sang, and the pastor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing her silence in his dreams, her hands still outstretched, her mercy still offered. Hope was growing, fear was spreading, and he was caught between them, no longer certain which side he stood on. The storm announced itself with a long, low growl over the hills, a sound that rolled through the valley and rattled the glass in every window. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. Wind ran its fingers through the trees until leaves tore free and whirled across the square like startled birds. Doors were bolted, lanterns were brought inside, but no one, not even the most cautious among them, could pretend they didn't know where the storm would test them first. The broken statue still lay where it had fallen. The largest fragments had been gathered into a kind of careful circle, the torso set upright and braced with stones, the robe's carved folds facing outward, the cracked face resting on a folded cloth at its base. As if even in ruin, she deserved gentleness. The candle that would not melt flickered stubbornly in a jar, haloing the rubble in a small, steady crown of light. The fragrance of roses came and went with the wind, faint, then strong, then faint again, like a breath. Pastor John felt the storm before it struck. He stood at the church door alone, one hand on the latch, his other pressed flat to the heavy wood as thunder shook the frame. Lightning peeled open the sky far off, a jagged white vein that stitched itself shut again in the next second. He told himself he had stayed to check the roof, to secure the hymnals, to protect the place that had been entrusted to his care. But he knew that wasn't the only reason. Each night, he had watched the faithful gather at the rubble. Each night, his dreams had returned. The sorrowful woman, the hands extended, the question he could not answer. Tonight, the storm would either prove him right or break him. Across the square, the widow Maria walked with her shawl wrapped tight, the wind lifting its edges like wings. A handful of neighbors followed in silence, They should have been home. Windows barred, children pulled close. Instead, they came to the broken statue as if called by a bell no one could see. Maria knelt first. She touched 2 fingers to the cracked face and then to her brow. "We are here," she whispered, "as you were." The first hard drops hit like pebbles. Then the rain came in sheets, sideways and cold, stinging cheeks and hands. Someone cried out that they should go, that the lightning would find them in the open. But Maria only raised her chin. "We do not run from what has already stood for us." No one argued after that. They formed a tight semicircle, backs to the wind, shielding the candle in its glass as best they could. The flame bent and swayed, but did not go out. In the church doorway, the pastor watched their stubborn little enclave of light, anger, and longing warring in his chest. He stepped out into the rain as if to call them off, then stopped midway down the steps. The words thinned and died on his tongue. He could not bring himself to shout at them. Not tonight, not with the thunder marching closer. The wind rose to a howl. Tree branches clawed at the sky. The bell rope in the church tower, frayed since spring, snapped and slapped the stone with a sound like a whip crack. A shutter tore free and skittered across the square, slamming to a stop against the low stones surrounding the rubble. A child whimpered and was gathered into a mother's arms. Maria began to pray aloud. Her voice wasn't loud, but it steadied the air around them. "Hail Mary, full of grace." Another flash, closer, blinding, and the world went white. In the same breath, thunder broke overhead so violently that the church steps shuddered. The pastor gripped the rail until his knuckles whitened. The hair on his arms lifted. The smell of ozone burned sharp in his throat. Then it happened. Lightning struck the cobbles 10 paces from the fragments, not the statue itself, not the people gathered, but close enough that the impact exploded stone into glistening shards and threw a spray of water waist-high. For a heartbeat, there was only shock. The gasp, the flinch, the involuntary cry. And then, as vision returned, the square revealed something no one would forget. The broken remains were glowing, not blazing, not consuming fire, but a soft, steady radiance, as if light had been poured into the cracks themselves. The fissures along the robe lit first, thin lines of warm gold running like rivers through the grey. Then the fractured face, cradled on the cloth, suffused with a quiet light from within, not from the candle, not from the lightning, but from some impossible center. The jarred flame burned, unchanged, beside it, a small earthly echo to the stranger light, now living in stone. No one spoke. Rain hammered their shoulders, plastered hair to their scalps, ran in cold ropes down their backs. But within the little circle, the air felt different. Not dry, not warm, and yet somehow untouched by the panic roiling across the square. A boy reached out with trembling fingers and stopped short, dazzled, afraid. The mother beside him whispered, "Don't," not because she feared the light, but because she feared her heart would break if it fled. From the church steps, the pastor took one halting step forward, then another. The hammer he had used that day wasn't in his hand, but he felt its weight as if it were. More than the weight, the echo of the blow, of that crack rolling across stone and soul. He moved until he stood at the edge of the little assembly. No one looked at him. All eyes were on the glow. "Even broken," Maria said, voice barely more than breath, "she still stands." It wasn't literally true. The torso leaned, braced by stones, the face lay apart. Yet everyone understood. What had been smashed refused to be silenced. What had been called nothing still gave itself as a sign. And in that moment, the words felt truer than any geometry the scene might contradict. Another lightning stroke ripped the far end of the square, splintering the tall elm that had shaded summer markets for 3 generations. It split clean down the trunk with a sound like a giant exhale, then toppled, not toward the gathered villagers, not toward the fragments, but away, as if some invisible hand had already judged the angle. It crashed in a shower of leaves that the wind immediately scattered. The glow did not flicker. The pastor's knees weakened. He wasn't a man given to faintness. He had held dying hands without trembling, had faced fathers who buried sons without losing his voice. But what stood, no, what shone, before him, undid and anchoring inside he hadn't realized, depended on his certainty. He took one more step, eyes locked on the lit face, and the world telescoped until there was nothing but light and rain and that silent, sorrowful gaze. He collapsed. It was not dramatic. No theatrics, no arms flung wide. He folded like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally reached the place where he could set it down. His knees hit water, then stone. His palms, instinctively searching, found the edge of the cloth beneath the face. The radiance painted his skin. He didn't pull back. A murmur rippled through the circle, a wave of sound shaped like prayer. No one reached to lift him. No one dared. The storm pressed its fury against the square. The little jar flame burned. The cracks shone. And in the widening silence between thunder and the next thunder, a strange peace slid into place. Even broken, someone else whispered. She still stands. Even broken, answered another. The words moved outward, picked up by the wind, passed along the ring of soaked shoulders and bowed heads until it no longer mattered who had started them. The phrase became its own kind of hymn, a call and response between ruin and mercy. The pastor bowed his head. He did not weep, not yet. He did not speak, not yet. But the fight drained from his jaw, from the line of his shoulders. In his chest, the old argument, stone versus spirit, idolatry versus worship, loosened its iron grip. He was not acquitting himself. He was not condemning himself. He was, for the first time since the hammer fell, simply present. Thunder rolled away toward the river. The rain softened from a lash to a veil. In the tower above them, the headless bell rope, useless moments ago, stirred and tapped against the stone with a soft, irregular rhythm that sounded, to those whose hearts were listening, like a lullaby for grief. The glow faded slowly, the way embers fall back to their own color after breathing bright. No one moved until it was gone. When at last it settled to the ordinary gray of stone, the candle's small, stubborn light seemed almost impertinent by comparison, and yet it comforted them because it was still there. Ordinary light for an ordinary night, after a not ordinary grace. The pastor pushed himself upright. Maria was the only one who met his eyes. She did not accuse him. She did not absolve him. She simply offered him a corner of her shawl to wipe the rain from his face, the way a mother might steady a son returned from a long-lost road. "Come," she said, as if guiding him to a place he didn't know he had needed. "Pray with us." He did not say yes. He did not need to. He stepped into the circle, knelt beside the fragments he had made, and let the silence do what his words had never managed: tell the truth. Around them, the villagers drew closer, shoulders touching, breaths visible in the cooling air. Some cried freely now, others stood with eyes closed, lips moving. Above them, the clouds were opening by degrees, and through one narrow seam, a single star looked down, faint but certain. No one would be able to explain it cleanly later, not the timing of the strike, not the way the elm fell, not the light in the cracks, not the steadiness that followed. Explanations would be attempted and exchanged, argued over and set aside, but the sentence that survived the storm would be simple enough for a child to carry. Even broken, she still stands. And in the days that followed, those words would become the ground beneath their feet, for the pastor who had fallen, for the widow who had stayed, and for a village that was learning, at last, that mercy does not leave when shattered. What came next would not rebuild stone in an instant. It would rebuild hearts and hands, one humbled act at a time. The square no longer looked the same. The cobblestones were still scarred from the lightning strike. The great elm tree lay fallen and cut into logs, and the fragments of the Virgin Mary remained scattered across their cloth, like the aftermath of a battle. Yet something had shifted. The air no longer held the sharp edge of division. Instead, it carried a fragile quiet, the kind that follows a storm, when even the birds pause before singing again. And at the heart of that quiet stood Pastor John. He was not the same man who had lifted a hammer weeks ago and shattered the statue in front of his people. His shoulders had lost their defiance. His voice, once booming with righteous certainty, was softer now, sometimes halting. And his eyes that once burned with the heat of argument, now seemed to search for something he wasn't sure he would ever find. On the first morning after the storm, he returned to the square, alone. His boots splashed through puddles as he crossed the cobblestones, carrying nothing but his hands and the weight of his own shame. When he reached the pile of fragments, he knelt, not out of instinct, but out of surrender. His fingers traced the broken edge of Mary's robe. The memory of the hammer blow burned through his chest, but alongside it came the memory of her silent gaze in his dreams and the light that had poured from these very cracks the night before. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, he spoke. "It wasn't about stone. It was about what I refused to see." That same afternoon, the townspeople found him still there, carefully gathering the pieces, laying them in order as though arranging a puzzle too precious to mishandle. At first, they watched in silence, unsure if this was another act of pride. But when Maria, the widow, stepped forward and placed her frail hands on his, they saw the truth. His hands trembled, his eyes brimmed. This was not a man trying to prove himself right. This was a man undone, desperate to help heal what he had broken. "Let us do it together," Maria said softly. Word spread quickly. By evening, the square was filled with villagers bringing tools, cloths, and small offerings. The carpenter brought glue and clamps. Children carried buckets of water to wash the dust from the fragments. Even skeptics came, not quite ready to pray, but ready to work. And at the center of it all was Pastor John, kneeling side by side with Maria, lifting each fragment with the reverence of a relic. The restoration was slow. Some pieces fit neatly together, others had been too badly damaged to align perfectly. A hand was missing, a fold of the robe too chipped to restore. But the villagers discovered that imperfection could be its own kind of beauty. A young artist painted the seams with delicate strokes, not to hide them, but to honor them, like scars that told a story of survival. All the while, the pastor said little, but when he did speak, his words were different than before. "I thought faith was about being right," he confessed one evening as the last rays of sun caught the repaired torso. "I thought it was about tearing down what I believed was wrong. But mercy waits even for the one holding the hammer." No one corrected him. No one needed to. By the third week, the statue was standing again. Not flawless, the cracks remained visible. A hand was carved anew, and the paint did not match perfectly. But to the villagers, it was more beautiful than ever. They gathered for the unveiling with no fanfare, no trumpets, only candles and quiet prayers. When the cloth was lifted, gasps broke the silence. She stood there again, not as untouched stone, but as a testimony that even brokenness can be made whole. Tears streamed down faces young and old. Some knelt at once, crossing themselves. Others stood still, holding hands. Maria wept openly, her rosary clutched tight against her chest. And then all eyes turned toward Pastor John. He did not stand above them this time. He did not preach. He simply knelt at the base of the statue, placed his forehead against the stone, and whispered, "Forgive me." The crowd did not cheer. They did not clap. They joined him. One by one, men, women, and children dropped to their knees until the entire square became a sea of bowed heads. Candles, flickering like stars, scattered across the ground. For the first time in memory, there were no arguments, no divisions, only unity, born not of victory, but of mercy. From that day forward, the statue became more than a monument. It became the heart of the village. People brought flowers not only in times of grief, but in times of joy. Candles were lit for prayers of thanksgiving as much as for desperation. Children played nearby with laughter that no longer felt out of place, because the square was alive again. Pilgrims began to arrive, drawn by whispers of what had happened, of a statue broken and rebuilt, of light in the cracks, of a pastor transformed. Some came in curiosity, some in skepticism, but few left unchanged. Pastor John's sermons changed too. He no longer thundered from the pulpit, pointing fingers and wielding scripture like a weapon. Instead, he spoke with pauses, with humility, often with tears. "Faith," he said once, his voice thick with emotion, "is not about proving others wrong. It's about learning to kneel even when you don't have the answers. And mercy does not leave us, even when we think we've shattered it." The villagers never forgot the storm, the glow, the cracks that still marked the statue's robe. They didn't want to forget, for the cracks reminded them that faith wasn't about perfection. It was about endurance, about grace that remains when everything else falls apart. And as for the pastor, he no longer dreamed of a sorrowful woman asking why. Instead, when sleep took him, he sometimes dreamed of her gaze filled with peace, her hands no longer extended in question, but in welcome. The town had been divided once. Now it was whole. Not because every doubt had been answered, but because mercy had chosen to remain. Even when shattered, grace remained.